outside, and I'm happy to talk to you about it afterward, as is Isaac is here somewhere. Isaac is the other person you could speak to if you want to know more. I'm not talking into the mic, I'm sorry. Okay, so I just have a few opening remarks before I introduce our speakers. You probably have noticed, and I know some people have been making the rounds of these, that these conferences on the future of work, most of them don't mention the future of capitalism, but that's Murphy, you know, that's us, are a kind of a cottage industry now. Like there's one every week or so, sometimes more often. Somebody told me they were at one yesterday in DC. So this sort of again raises the question of why now, and you know, academia is also kind of taking up this question, and often with the panic button of, you know, mass unemployment that we heard about this morning. I think maybe it's, somebody made the point this morning that the part of why we're hearing so much about this is that the people who write the stories in the media are feeling vulnerable, and I suspect academics maybe are too. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm in the middle of reading a little book called The Slow Professor, which you know, I'm one of those anyway, but which, although not in my speed of talking, as you may have noticed, but but it advocates like a sort of resistance to the speed up, and some of which is technology driven. But I think more generally the adjunctification of academia, that is the growth of precarious labor in academia, and also what's happening with graduate student labor, which I'm sure you've all been hearing about, is probably part of the story too. So we write about this stuff as well as academics, and maybe that's another reason just to add to that conversation. Okay, so the two key themes as I see it in the last session were power, as Heidi put it earlier, the power bias technological change and the need to confront the issue of employer power. And the flip side of that is precarity, which is the kind of buzzword in my field, the sociology of labor right now. And those two themes you'll be hearing more about in this session, although it doesn't appear to be about that. So we planned this conference several months ago, and this issue of surveillance was sort of central to our thinking from the beginning. And I should confess that I am an unabashed fan of Shoshana Zuboff, our first speaker today, keynote speaker at this session. I vividly remember her first book called In the Age of the Smart Machine, which was actually provoked by an earlier wave of robotization and automation and computerization in the workplace. And she reminded me that it came out in 1988. Somehow I thought it was 1984, which would have been more perfect for our theme today, but whatever. Anyway, a while ago. It was edited by, I guess he's not here today, but Steve Fraser, who at the time worked for Basic Books and now works here at the Murphy Institute and is one of the key editors of our journal, New Labor Forum, that you may know. So, you know, all these weird connections. When that book came out, I myself was involved in a study of the auto industry, which was being heavily robotized at the time. And this book really changed my whole way of thinking about it. And I don't have time to go into the whole argument, but the key argument was that at that time, this was a period when everybody was talking about the so-called second industrial divide. The older people in the room may remember some of this conversation. The idea that new technology was going to somehow liberate workers and open the door to what was then called flexible specialization, a new world of work where, you know, everything we would be able to learn while we labored and all that. And she pointed out, among other things, that perspective, that narrative, as we would call it today, missed the whole dynamic of power in the workplace, and that managers were not going to let this happen. It's a kind of crude version of at least part of the argument. I hope I'm not destroying. Look, she'll correct me if I'm wrong. So that's very much central to her work. So more recently, I myself was part of a National Academy of Sciences panel on technology in the workplace. And so it was very corporate oriented, even though it was a government sponsored event, and committee. And so I was sort of casting about for interesting things to read beyond what we were reading as a group. And I turned up this, two things actually. Heidi's the co-author of one of them, which is Don't Blame the Robots, which is a great piece about how the problem in the workplace is not robots, it's, you know, employer power. And also an extraordinary article by Shoshana, which is, as I understand it, the core of her forthcoming book. And the article is called The Big Other. And I have been promoting it regularly to friends and colleagues and students. It's, and I'm looking forward to hearing today's rendition and the fuller argument in the book. The central concept is the idea of surveillance capitalism, which, as I understand it, the argument is that this is a new kind of capitalism, different from Fordist mass production era capitalism. She'll tell you more. And I must say, in the wake of the Cambridge Analytics saga and other recent events, this seems more relevant every day. So you'll hear that from Shoshana in much more detail. But before we hand the podium over to her, I just want to say a few words about our two respondents on this panel. One is a CUNY faculty member, Christian Parenti, who's also a prolific journalist and writer of books and so on. We thought he'd be a perfect respondent for this panel because of his book published in 2000, one of many books he's written, but this is the one that's most relevant here. It's called The Soft Cage: Surveillance in America from Slavery to the War on Terror, which, as you can tell from the title, offers an in-depth historical account of this phenomenon. So as Josh mentioned at the very beginning of the day, all these issues are, even though they appear novel, are actually deeply embedded in American and world history. So that'll be our first respondent. And then our second one is Carrie Gleason, who now hails from the Center for Popular Democracy, but is perhaps, at least to me, best known for her incredibly imaginative co-launching of the Retail Action Project back in 2005. And she served as its executive director for 5 years, starting in 2010. And this is the group that you may not know the name, but you know the issue that they lifted up into the public conversation, which is technology-driven retail scheduling, clopening, all of that, and the need for retail workers to organize some response to that in the form of what in San Francisco is called the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights and is taking various other forms around the country. She is still the go-to organizer on those issues, but has a kind of broader portfolio now, which I guess you'll hear about. So without further ado, let me please join me in welcoming Shoshana Zuboff.
Ruth, can you remind me, we have 20 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So can you give me a nudge at 15? Okay. Because there's a lot to talk about. And I thought, I'll throw out some ideas now and get ourselves started, and the conversation later will help us fill in some more pieces depending on the aspects of this topic that most interest you. So I'm very keen on that. So I want to start with just a short little video clip. And everybody have access to a screen somewhere?
Hey, bro! Listen, I was trying to buy this handcrafted mahogany wood model of a B-25 Mitchell Panchito aircraft.
Aw, for me?
Don't sass me. And I went to this website, and this ad popped up that said, "Hey, Ron Swanson, check out this great offer."
What's your question?
My question is, what the hell?
Like, how do they know who you are?
Yeah.
Okay. There are these things called cookies, where, like, if you go to a site and buy something, it'll remember you and then create ads for other stuff you might want to buy.
So it learns information about me? Seems like an invasion of privacy.
Dude, if you think that's bad, go to Google Earth and type in your address.
Welcome to my world. This is what keeps me up at night in one way or another, and has for the last 7 years. I've been working on a new book on this subject, which I finished 2 days ago. So, one of the rare moments I'm out of my pajamas in a room full of people, and it's a delight to be here with you. And Ruth, I'm so grateful for your kind words, and I regard you as one of the greats in our field of sociology, and I'm so honored to be here. So let's talk a little bit about what just happened. In the year 2000, before the invention or discovery of surveillance capitalism, a group of computer scientists and engineers at Georgia Tech collaborated on a project that they called the Aware Home. So I want to tell you a little bit about how they thought about this project. It was meant to be a living laboratory for the study of, you've heard this word before, ubiquitous computing. The idea, quote, was that the home was to be a human-home symbiosis in which inanimate and animate processes would be captured by an elaborate network of context-aware sensors and wearable computers, and that would all be translated into a steady flow of data, and this was called an automated wireless collaboration. Collaboration between what? Between the platform that hosted the personal information and a second platform that hosted the environmental information. Most notable in this structure is that the Aware Home was imagined as a simple, single, closed loop. What do I mean by that? There were only 2 nodes in this, quote, network, and they were controlled entirely by the home's occupants. So here's what they wrote about their reasoning, their sort of meta-reasoning about this process. Because the house would be, quote, constantly monitoring the occupants, their whereabouts and their activities, even tracing the inhabitants' medical conditions, the team concluded, quote, there is a clear need to give the occupants knowledge and control of the distribution of this information. All the information is to be stored on the occupants' wearable computers to ensure the privacy of each individual's information. Okay? Simple closed loop. Now, that was the year 2000, which was not that long ago. Let's fast forward to this afternoon. This afternoon, if you consider purchasing an Alphabet-owned Nest thermostat for your house, here's what's in store for you. The terms of service and end-user licensing agreements reveal oppressive privacy and security consequences in which sensitive information is shared with many devices, unnamed personnel, and third parties for the purposes of analysis and ultimately for trading in what I call behavioral futures markets. Nest takes little responsibility for the security of any of this information and none for how any of these other companies who are also sharing in this information will put it to use or guard its security. In fact, Guido Noto-La-Diega and Ian Walton, both at the University of London, did a beautiful study. They're both legal scholars. They analyzed these privacy documents for the Nest thermostat, and they reckon that if you enter into the Nest ecosystem of connected devices and apps and third parties and so on, and each with the same, the privacy terms, the terms of service, and so forth, the purchase of a single home thermostat requires you to review over 1,000 legal contracts. Okay. So, should the customer refuse to agree to these onerous stipulations, Nest has an answer. What they do is the functionality and the security of the device itself is compromised. It's no longer supported by updates meant to ensure its reliability and safety. The consequences can range from frozen pipes to failed smoke alarms. The bottom line is that the effectiveness and safety of the product are brazenly held hostage to the owner's submission to its terms, a conquest by and for others' interests. ergo surveillance capitalism. So what just happened here? That was my question. What just happened? What happened in these 18 years is not a story about technology. That's number one. It's a story about capitalism. Specifically, in my view, surveillance capitalism. The surveillance in surveillance capitalism obviously communicates the social relations of unilateral power. That's why it's surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism is unprecedented. There's a whole piece here that I'm very interested in that maybe we'll have a little chance to talk about it, but there is a sociology of the unprecedented. The unprecedented by nature cannot be cognized. That's why 100 years ago we thought of automobiles as horseless carriages. So we have an unprecedented new capitalism that cannot be interrupted until we actually understand precisely how it works. Third point I want to make is, in my view, we are at the beginning, not the middle, and certainly not the end of what will be a collective struggle over the future of surveillance capitalism and more generally information capitalism. So let me kind of set the stage by saying this, and it, you know, I'm throwing line out to encompass some of the conversation earlier today. The titanic power struggles of the last century, and in general of the industrial age, were between capital and labor. I was just seeing how fast that was going to go by. Not fast enough. Today, we face a new kind of struggle that includes, but moves beyond, those earlier opponents. Today, the struggle we face is between information capital and the entirety of our societies, right down to each individual citizen. Information capital bears down on our bodies. It bears down on our homes. The digital economy is not something out there. It doesn't live in factories and offices. The digital economy is here, is us. And the question is, with what consequences? In my view, this transition to this new reality of surveillance capitalism has been impeded intellectually for folks like us, in part because for a long time, ideas like digital economy or information economy or digital capitalism, information capitalism, the assumption in these concepts was that the technology was neutral. It was just better, faster, cheaper. And that's certainly, you know, what Castells argued way back. And so we didn't really get that this isn't just about better, faster, cheaper. This is the way in which digital technologies have enabled the creation of wholly new market forms and new economic logics that are wholly indigenous to the digital. New logics of accumulation that are unimaginable outside the digital milieu. So you've heard of the idea of digital natives, like, you know, our kids. Well, now we have capitalisms that are digital natives. And they require our urgent attention, in my view. Okay, so a little bit of background. 2001, under extreme pressure from its investors, surveillance capitalism was invented at Google as the solution to financial emergency. So in much the same way in which at the third try at the Ford Motor Company, you know, all the pieces came together and there was a day where it was like, yeah, mass production was invented that day at Ford. You know, and the way we attribute the real honing and completion of the whole idea of managerial capitalism with General Motors. Surveillance capitalism births at Google. And it spread to Facebook pretty quickly, and then to other internet-based businesses and applications. However, it's now migrating to a much wider range of real world, that's always a tricky one, real world goods and service providers who are mobilizing around this one version of information capitalism. For example, this surveillance capitalism as a form of information capitalism, I say that it has become the default model, certainly in the online world. A really interesting analysis of the top 1 million websites found that 90% leak to an average of 9 external domains that track, capture, and expropriate user data for commercial purposes. 78% of those initiate third-party transfers to domains owned by Google, and another 34% transfer data to domains owned by Facebook. So these were the first 2 big pioneers, and they still remain the biggest forces in surveillance capitalism. I argue in my book that Microsoft has joined the party, and when we get to the other big companies, it's a more complicated discussion. But I want to show you how this has moved to what we call the real world. A producer of bar equipment celebrates the new trend toward smart bottles and packaging. And he says, it's really all about allowing our bar owners to see stuff about our customers that they couldn't see before and maximize their profits. And the CEO of Allstate Insurance says he wants his company to be like Google and monetize data about its customers. Quote, should we sell the information we get from people driving around to various other people and capture some additional profit source? This is the terrain on which the battle for the future of the digital economy will be waged. And in my view, this is not about like the little regulations here or some fines there or some technological fixes. My view is that this is a discussion about the fundamental legitimacy of the mechanisms that comprise surveillance capitalism. And so that's what I want to talk about next. What are these mechanisms? Well, most people credit Google's success to what's called its advertising model, but in fact, the series of discoveries that led to Google's rapid accumulation of revenue and market accumulation only incidentally refer to advertising, and I'll explain that in a minute. Google's success derives from its ability to predict the future, specifically the future of human behavior. From the start, Google had collected data on users. As people searched, they collected data about the search. They also discovered pretty early on that every time people searched, there were little traces of collateral data that got spewed out with those searches. And for a long time, they didn't really think too much about those data. They were called data exhausts, and they were stuck in servers, and they were not organized or used in any way. So eventually, some things happened in the company. Some smart, curious people did some experiments, and they began to realize, I'm obviously telescoping a lot of things here, they began to realize that these so-called data exhausts had some serious predictive power, and that there had to be a way to systematically rope in all of this so-called data exhaust and use its predictive power. But they hadn't really figured out how to do that yet. In the meantime, the company is using behavioral data to improve search. And they really wanted search to be, even back then in 2001, they called search, an AI. Today it really wouldn't be called an AI, but that's how they thought about it then. And they wanted it to be the best, most powerful AI in the world. And the problem was that they would take the behavioral data from users and they would improve search, and then people would use Google search more, and it was a virtuous circle. And it went round and round that way. And I call it the behavioral value reinvestment cycle, the idea being that all the value they're getting from these behavioral data, they're reinvesting in the product, and they're attracting more users / maybe even customers at that point. It wasn't clear. And then they're getting more data, and it's a virtuous circle. And it's a closed loop. Remember the closed loop? But the thing was that there was no place to extract value in this loop. Where is the value going to come from? So, you know, there were lots of ideas floated back then, including charging users and making them customers, which would have saved us all a lot of grief. But they were afraid to do that because in this cycle, the company needed the user / customer just as much as the customer / user needed search, right? So there was a reciprocity, a balance of power, if you will. Wow, okay. I can? Okay. All right, I'm going to get through the short version, and so maybe 10 minutes. Okay, perfect. So the thing is that this was super cool, and everybody in Silicon Valley knew that this was super cool, but it was not yet capitalism. That was a problem. It really became a problem during the period of time known as the dot-com bust. A lot of pressure on those boys, a lot of pressure. Investors, very high level, very prestigious investors, even threatening to pull out, despite how smart all of this was. And it was that moment of what I call financial emergency that the Google founders decided that they were going to change the whole ad equation. And instead of advertisers choosing keywords, it was going to be the Google people using their incredible analytic capabilities, now mining what we used to call data exhaust, using that so-called data exhaust to predict where is the exact spot that an advertiser should place their ad, targeted. And they were going to tell advertisers, black box operation. All the advertisers got to know was the outcome. Put it here, and you will get click-throughs. And that's what the advertisers did. And so that started in around 2002, and what I wanted you to know that between that time, sort of late 2001, 2002, and 2004, which was what? That was the company IPO. Revenues at Google increased by 3,590%. And that was known as the secret strategy, because within the company, no one outside was allowed to know how much money they were making and how quickly. All right, so kudos went to the data scientists. Kudos went to the technologies. But actually, this success did not depend on technology or data science. This success depended on 4 key social facts. And those facts were that human experience is available to be claimed as free and rendered as behavioral data. Second, that the new methods with which that rendering would occur willfully ignored individual claims to self-determination by usurping individual decision rights. 3, that these operations were secret and opaque by design, legible only to a narrow priesthood, and therefore intentionally architected to produce ignorance. And finally, that the whole thing could succeed as long as it was in lawless space. Now it's clear that this shift in the use of behavioral data was an historic turning point. Instead of user-generated behavioral data for system improvement, Google had discovered what I call a behavioral surplus. And that surplus scraped largely unilaterally and outside of users' awareness from human experience, that surplus became the game-changing, zero-cost asset that could be diverted from service improvement, no more closed loop, toward a genuine market exchange. This was not an exchange with users, but rather with other companies who learned how to make money from low-risk bets on user behavior. So this is what I want you to think about. So what I'm saying here is, first of all, here, let me go back a second. Just look at the top. So the new system here is behavioral surplus coming up from human experience as people search and engage with Google in other ways, being shunted into what I call a new means of production, which I would summarize as machine intelligence. Machine intelligence has many disciplines in it. Some, AI, machine learning, there's a whole lot of language, and it's easy to get just really tied up in that language and not see the big picture. Smart machines. So it's being fed into these production processes in order to fabricate a new kind of product that I call a prediction product. These products aim to predict human behavior. They are sold into new kinds of markets that originally were convened by Google. And the main players in these markets originally were advertisers. But that's an accident of history, because now we see that there are insurance companies playing in these markets, and there are retailers playing in these markets, and there are automobile companies playing in these markets, and there are people who are buying bar equipment playing in these markets. So this is out there now, and there are all kinds of markets like this, all trading in behavioral futures. That's what's producing revenue, and that's what is producing profit. So now you see how our original closed loop, back to the template of the aware home, is now subordinated, and indeed one might say subjugated, to this larger process. And it's this larger process, in the markets for behavioral futures, that are producing revenue. And everything that is happening now with users is a means to an end, is a means to others' ends, is a means to others' commercial purposes. Now, what this means is that, let me make 2 points and then I'll stop. Behavioral surplus, they have learned over time that behavioral surplus is not only valuable, but there are levels and gradations of behavioral surplus that make them even more valuable. So once this becomes a competitive dynamic, the key thing is hunting and finding and hijacking and kidnapping and dispossessing the behavioral surplus that has the greatest predictive power. So we began with scale online, just volumes of behavioral surplus. And then we moved to scope, which is moving offline into all kinds of things like, where you are, and are you laughing, are you happy, are you running in the park, do you need new running shoes, scope, all kinds of varied data. And then also action, the idea that if we can actually intervene in your behavior and slightly shift it one way or another, the surplus that we can take from that is highly predictive, because we are already in there modifying your behavior. So our predictions are even more powerful. I'm just going to read you what one data scientist said to me, works at an education company in Silicon Valley. The goal of everything we do is to change people's actual behavior at scale. When people use our app, we can capture their behaviors, identify good and bad, develop ways to reward the good and punish the bad. We can test how actionable our cues are for them and how profitable for us. All right. So I'm going to bring this to a close by saying that what we're seeing in our lifetimes is a shift in the structure of capitalism from value being produced from products to value and profits being produced from services, profits being produced from speculation, and now profits being produced from surveillance. Once we begin to understand these foundational mechanisms, and hopefully later we'll be able to get into more of the strategies that build from this, it becomes clear that demanding privacy from a surveillance capitalist or lobbying for an end to commercial surveillance is like asking Henry Ford to make every Model T by hand. Or it's like asking a giraffe to shorten its neck or a cow to give up chewing. This is an essential existential threat to surveillance capitalism. These are things that it cannot change and be successful. So with that, let me stop, and hopefully during our Q&A we'll be able to get into a little more of the consequences. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now our first commentator is Christian Parenti.
Hello. How do I turn off this computer? Speaking of computers. Well, I guess we'll just have to live with it. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really nice to... I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I don't do this sort of stuff. I like to turn computer screens off, because I inevitably end up looking at them, but I guess we can't turn it off. That's how the attention economy works. I thought that was a great presentation. I'm really looking forward to your book. I'm of two minds about this whole issue, and it's a genuine kind of conflict within myself. On the one hand, the rise of the surveillance technology that Shoshone has called surveillance capitalism is very new and threatening. And then at another level, there's a way in which it's as old as the hills, and lots of perennial problems in capitalism keep reemerging within this. And there's a very clear element of total bullshit coming out of Silicon Valley. And I toggle between being like, wow, these guys are the cutting edge, and like, these guys ran out of ideas 20 years ago. Witness self-driving cars. We've been hearing about this for 10 years now. And part of what's going on, I think, in this surveillance, the role of surveillance in capitalism, is that it serves as a discourse of intimidation. It is a mechanism of control. You can, if you have your workforce all logged in with radio frequency badges coming and going through electronic doors, and you have cameras on people, and every keystroke is monitored, you can always find some problem with everyone's work record and get rid of people that you don't want. So it really empowers management a lot. But there's another way in which there are real limits to what this kind of stuff can do. So in the discourse around self-driving cars, you'll often hear this conflation of ability and computation, and they're not the same thing at all, right? Murphy's law, or whatever the law is about, you know, the doubling of computation capacity. This is frequently discussed as if it's the ability for machines to do all sorts of stuff. And it's true, computers can analyze vast amounts of information and more with every day, but that doesn't mean that the cameras that they use on these cars, which are supposed to be able to see things, are necessarily improving at that rate, and they're not. And there's certain other features of the technology which don't have to do only with the computation of information that comes in, but the actual capture of information that's not developing as fast as the proponents of all this stuff would say. So those are that. In a nutshell, this is the kind of the tension I see around this sort of stuff. The real problem that I think surveillance capitalism, to use Shoshona's term, poses is to our consciousness, right? and it is the threat of panopticism. What does it do to a people? What does it do to workers to be completely habituated to surveillance, right? And this is what Foucault calls panopticism, right? We start analyzing ourselves. We internalize the control. And that seems like a pretty serious threat to class struggle. And it is one that is facilitated tremendously by, being a digital native, right? The great fear and failure of many a digital native is not that they'll be under surveillance, but that they won't be, right? That they won't have their 15 minutes of fame, that no one's looking. So how to organize people with that sort of mentality is a serious challenge. There's also really stark criminal justice and private sector collaboration in this. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who lives out in Michigan, and he's a labor organizer, but he's married to a woman who's undocumented, and his brother-in-law was arrested within 100 miles of the border because 100 miles from all borders, including the coast, is a constitution-free. You have no Fourth Amendment rights. Police and immigration rarely go that far. I mean, they do it on the southern border and increasingly on the northern border, but they can stop people without probable cause and just demand a CID and make immigration arrests. And that's what happened to him. This guy was taking his family on a vacation in northern Michigan, got within the 100-mile zone, had some Mexican music playing in the minivan, some racist cop didn't like it, checked their papers. And so this guy, Baltazar, he's first then threatened, he's here undocumented, he's threatened with deportation, he's put in jail for 4 months, then he's released. He has to wear an ankle monitor for a year, he has to drive across the state and check in for a year, and then during one of these meetings they randomly tell him that he can take off the ankle bracelet and that he's been given a work visa, but he is definitely going to be deported, and he's going to be deported within 2 to 5 years, and it's not clear how far off that is in the future. And in the meantime, he now has a work permit, he has bought a vehicle, and he's started a business laying down carpet, and his labor discipline is incredible. I mean, this guy is never going to join a union. This guy is never going to resist the system, right? He's fighting to keep his family, keep his family together and stay in this country. And I was just, I don't have the stats on it, but I was asking around, sort of how common is this? And the word is sort of like, pretty much, at least in Michigan, every crew of like maybe 10 or 20 Latino laborers, you're going to have 1 or 2 people who are in this kind of situation, who are on this like government surveillance work release, infusing a kind of intimidation into the general laboring population. Now, whether or not that's consciously developed or whether it develops haphazardly, it certainly serves the purpose of assisting capital. So that's very, very frightening. And in terms of the threat of automation, I think this is an important problem that is also at one level real, but also there's a perennial discourse of like the robots are coming. I'm sorry I missed this morning's panel on that, but I've heard that it was very good. And in thinking about this, I rely on a good friend of mine, John Marshall, who's here, who's a researcher for the UFCW. And he's been looking into automation, and also my colleague, Josh Mason, up at John Jay in the economics program. And it was John who really first articulated, that I've heard of, this idea that the robots are coming is a discourse of intimidation, right? That this is about, that really the robots aren't showing up as much as this discourse would have you believe. And that this is part of, at a moment of a tightening labor market, to just terrify everybody, to get people to think like the self-driving trucks are coming. Pretty soon, Uber's going to own all the cars, all the trucks, and all these, when these last bastions of working class autonomy is going to be stripped away. And immediate questions arise, like, why would Uber want to own all these cars, right? Why would they want to fire all these drivers? From a Marxist perspective, too, you say, well, where's the labor content? You have to have labor power to have value, and this is the problem of the rising organic composition of capital, right? I mean, you cannot completely displace labor and still have surplus value at the end. In terms of self-driving cars, just think of all of the the disadvantages that would come to Uber for owning these cars. Currently, when they have human beings driving them, and the cars can be very heavily assisted with technology, right? Practically self-driving, almost entirely self-driving, but they still want someone in there so that that person pays the insurance, that person cleans the car, and if the vehicle runs someone over, that person is responsible. So I'm very skeptical about the idea that that the robots are coming. That it's much more a discourse of intimidation. And it's important to remember in this regard the ways that automation is, because it creates friction, is also shed by capital sometimes during production. It's not because capitalists read Marx and buy the labor theory of value and think that the organic rising composition of capital is going to lead to declining profits, but more immediate things like very famously Toyota experimented with how to get parts to its assembly line, and it was heavily automated, and they realized that the quickest thing to do was not automate this and just have chalkboards for people to write what parts they needed at a workstation, and then these would be delivered by hand. Swedish automobile makers shed the assembly line and returned to using teams that moved from workstation to workstation because it increased productivity and cut down on costs. So, in conclusion, in terms of to the extent that I'm arguing for a skepticism about this, I would suggest that we listen to Elon Musk and these types when they talk about the future and the threat of artificial intelligence. Listen closely. It's what are they describing? They're describing the present, right? And this is the Phil K. Dick line about technology in the future. That's it's already here. It's just not that well distributed. But if you listen to Elon Musk's description of what the future tyranny of AI would be, it's how most workers already live under capital, right? And there's a way in which you got to wonder, why should we be afraid of artificial intelligence? Would a world run by disinterested robots, and I think robots have to be seen as disinterested. They can have certain social interests embedded within them, like all technology, but why would robots do a worse job than the 1%? I mean, could they really be more destructive than this class? So I'm not saying don't worry about machines, but I guess I am trying to say that class struggle never ends. There is certainly the option of not complying. Lots of this information is voluntarily given, and that's the first place for workers of all classes, all colors of collar, to resist, to stop cooperating, stop using the new technology, don't put your courses on that sort of stuff, and develop a kind of class consciousness around technology. It is not neutral and efficient. It always involves the reproduction of class power dynamics.
Thanks, Christian. And our second commentator is Carrie Gleason.
Thanks, Ruth. Thank you for inviting me, for being here. I'm really always happy to come to Murphy. So to build off of what has been said before, I think about work every day. I think about technology every day. I started organizing retail workers in 2005, people down the block from us, and saw how the recession hit and companies literally laying off the full-time workforce, re-inviting them to be part-time, then telling them that they needed to call every day to find out whether or not they needed to work, saw the algorithms have disastrous effects on people's economic stability, not knowing how much you were going to make from one week to the next, told that this is the new efficiency, right? And so I do think, we learned very early on, retail salesperson's the most common job in America, learned very early on, right, that the values you put in technology is determined by people and people with power. And so when you think about the question of 1% owning, the robots couldn't be worse than the 1%. Well, the 1% owns the robots, and there's mounting corporate concentration. And last year, Amazon became the second largest retail company in America that's operating at a total loss, subsidized by all of our taxpayer dollars from their Amazon Web Services, right? Like, we are fueling what is happening, right? That's how they get us. And so, and it's not just, right, it isn't felt equally, right? Like, a lot of the examples have been brought up around how our data then is used to sell us more stuff. Well, that's like a very middle class analysis. We're not talking about how race and class and gender intersect in all of these forces of technology. And we know now, we see many, many states forcing people of work requirements to get food stamps, work requirements to get health care, right? We look at the prison industrial complex, which Christian has written a lot about, right? And how do we then think about these as new forms of control that are very explicit and very felt and very visible to continue to keep the economic system, which we know is rooted in slavery. And so, and we know that the current move by the right is rooted in an analysis of protecting private property. And what does it mean then in this moment where all of our data is just available? It's beyond property now, right? Like, we all are kind of subjugated in this infrastructure of our data being something that can be profited off of. But I want to kind of take a two steps back to talk about work, because people are still in workplaces, and how it plays out for the American worker is something I think we can learn from as we try to figure this out. Because it's true, we don't really understand it. We don't have theories to figure out how to break it down and then what to do all about it. So if you look at the case of, I want to think about two workplaces, right? Let's look at Amazon, and then let's look at, like, I don't know, an office worker, and how these technologies might play out. So in Amazon, if you're in a warehouse, you've got a sensor, you're tracked, right? How fast are you working? Is your hand going in the right place? And they just got the patent for a wristband. If your hand goes to the wrong product, it buzzes. For real. And so, right? So that's like intense, right? It's fast-paced, it's grueling days for $11 an hour, and it's very disciplinarian, right? Like, people, if you like, people are hyper disciplined, and then there's lots of churn. And this is for their workforce, right? They're moving away from subcontracted workers. These are people they employ. And all the same while they're learning from this, they're surveilling their workers to then automate them, right? Amazon, some people hail them as a job creator, but they're really just learning from this massive workforce to then automate it. So that's what it's like to work at Amazon. A little bit, right? That's not even half of it. I'm sure Mariah Montgomery from PWF could talk even more about it, or John Marshall here from the OCW. In terms of, like, what's happening in the broader retail workforce, so you walk in to a grocery store and your body heat is tracked to figure out where you go. They're heat sensors. They also, if you have your phone on, they can track when you go and leave and what you bought last. A lot of companies are really much more interested in surveilling, like, the consumer more than the worker, but they can learn from both. And the workforce is like a captured workforce, right? Starbucks is like the iconic brand that kind of treats its own workforce as a market. The other end of it, and this is like so far beyond just like just-in-time scheduling and like real-time technology, right? The surveillance is the next thing. The other end of it, so if you think then about The Office, the thing that there was this great in the New York Review of Books this month, there was a really great essay in it that talked about network efficiency index. So there's this idea that how we relate to each other, it's the behavioral futures, right? That matters, right? So how do you shape that to create new efficiencies in how we relate to each other? And so this essay talked about how there's this network efficiency index where people's frequency of interactions between people is tracked, and then the intimacy of those interactions is tracked. And so then you can actually create a metric of it. And one metric could be that you, in a week, have, two interactions that, like, frequency of, like, interactions that, like, maybe, like, 2 interactions a week that have 5 people or less in it, right? So you're having at least 2 intimate interactions that create deep connection that then maybe can get multiplied and networked out. So, I mean, we're all experiencing it in different ways. But then go back to the values and the question of power. what does it mean then if we were to get control of this data, right? Like, what would it mean if we actually had control of these technologies? And one of the things I think is super cool that I've seen come out is the work that Our is doing with this Work It app, right? Where they have an app that's a peer app where they use artificial intelligence, and the app learns from workers asking each other questions to learn about the company policies and then what to do about it and how to organize and exercise the rights that they have and demand for more rights, right? And so it's a really good example of like how actually we can use these tools, but a part of the problem is access, right? Who has access to these technologies? And once we figure it out, in some ways, the app is so far beyond what Google is doing and some of what Shoshana had already discussed. And so, you know, but it is something that we need to get better about. We need to understand the technology more and how we participate in it. What does it mean to have agency to disrupt this, right? And how do we even begin to say we want self-determination over our data when we have no idea what they're collecting about us, what they're doing with it, and how they make money off of it, right? So a part of the biggest challenge is that we're participating in all of it and it's not visible. And so I don't know what to do about that, and I think this is like a part of why these types of conferences are important. I think the other end of it, though, just to go back, so I think this is going to continue to take off. I think the fact that we have very few companies actually having this data is a problem for democracy. It's not good for us, right? When you think about Google or Facebook or Amazon, these are all corporate monopolies that we don't really, they're too big for us to regulate, right? Who's going to stand up to them? And so there is a moment where it still goes back to like, well, what is the solution? Well, there is like a social disruption, right? They're still worried about the pitchforks. Maybe they don't care if you buy a Ford anymore, but they know that social unrest is not good for what they want to do. And I think that is a moment right now where we're seeing it really play out in really horrible ways, right? Like there's the economic crisis that people are facing because they don't care if we buy Fords anymore. They don't care if we work hard anymore. It's actually better if we only work a little bit in like an hour and then go home and do something else and maybe go on to our next job, right? Like there is this crisis of work in America. But I do think they want to be able to get away with it. And so the more we figure out the game, the more that we can actually do something about it. Because the idea that, like, you know, I like the idea that we could end commercial surveillance. We could do that. We could just do that. Like what was like shared today, it doesn't have to be. It could be a different way. We could decide what we want tracked, how to use it, how to learn better, how to participate better in a more democracy that actually is driven by us. So I think that is like where this moment actually takes way more imagination than we ever had before. And, you know, I would say that, you know, we can't, a part of the challenge though is that it does take like much more of an awareness about who's being impacted, how and when. And I don't think, I think that is why it's like important to join organizations, and that is why this moment of movement is actually more important than ever, and I think gives me hope that actually as the consequences of what's happening with surveillance capitalism comes to bear, that actually we'll be able to find the way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. All right, there's a lot on the table here, and now it's your turn. Are you going to do the microphones, Isaac? So the floor is open. Could I just ask, I know we didn't do this in the morning, but if when you speak, please identify yourself just briefly. Yeah. Sure, why not? Let's start with the gentleman over there. And we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, like in the morning.
Hello, my name is Kofi. I have a few things to say. First of all, I don't want to leave here feeling kind of down by the kind of information that I'm receiving.
It's about capitalism, sorry.
Yeah, but the question about control and what has to be done, because you don't know how the information that is being harvested is going to be used. For example, most of these companies now have outsourced their HR departments to other companies that do the payment. And from my experience, we were moved onto a platform without our consent, and you needed to log into another website, provide your social security number and all this information to them for them to go ahead and then do the payroll for them to pay you. But the question is that you don't know the information they are harvesting from you and how that information is going to be used. Now, the issue of Cambridge Analytica recently have brought to the fore how some of this information wind up being used. And my fear is that, in part, the people that are responsible for any form of regulation, if there should ever be some kind of regulation, seem to be almost clueless as to what has to happen. When you follow what happened in the Congress when Mark Zuckerberg had to go answer some questions, it looks as if those people up there have little or no idea what has to happen. At least in the last few years in Europe, they've shown they've stood up a bit to Google and all these other companies, but we don't have that history here in the United States where you have regulators trying to stand up and maybe even fine them. So my question is that, what can we really do to deal with what is going on, especially when you have a lot of low-wage workers whose information is being harvested and used, and when people are only interested, for the most part, in surviving. The unions that are supposed to lead the way have next to no idea what to do. Then what do we do? What is the way forward?
Small question. Thank you very much. How about this gentleman here? In the back, right. Yeah.
I'd like to ask an uplifting question.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Jim Dingman from Pacifica. What about workers' resistance? The history of workers is filled with ways of saying, you know what, let me violate these goddamn rules all the time. And I can think of how digital media and all this data was used in the Seattle demonstrations to create the independent media centers, which was an amazing use of this technology to essentially put it back in their face. So what does the panel see in terms of resistance coming out of all this stuff? Because I can see it all the time. These tools are the best organizing tools one's ever seen, historically, to do all sorts of mischief. So what do you feel?
How about right here?
Hi, David M. Sokol. I try to follow a policy that was proposed by Cy Sims. He said an educated consumer is our best customer. So there are lots of ways to usurp Big Brother, short of putting aluminum in your hat. But my question, after this morning's panel and this panel, there's a thing called the doomsday clock. And they just announced that it moved closer to doomsday. So my question for the panel is, how close are we to the doomsday panel that says we're becoming a fascist state?
All right, well, maybe we should give our panelists a chance to respond to these, and then there's plenty of time for more, don't worry. I just want to throw in one more thing into the mix, which is sort of vaguely related to it, a couple of the questions raised, because I guess I thought Christian was going to talk about this, and you didn't much, which is, you know, when we think of surveillance, at least when I think of surveillance, typically we think of government surveillance, Edward Snowden, the NSA or whatever, which has not come up yet in this conversation. And I'd just like to include that in the responses, if you don't mind. Like, what are the implications of the new surveillance capitalism for the state? So what order should we go in? Do you all have a preference? Hold it close as we saw this morning to your mouth. Or you can come up here if you prefer.
Okay. Yes. I'm going to work backwards, starting with government surveillance. Okay, so when I started theorizing surveillance capitalism, I felt like it was the hole in the donut, because just about everything is about government surveillance. And as bad as government surveillance is, you know, ultimately, in some at least, you know, theoretical framework, ultimately the government is accountable to the Constitution of the United States. And when we're, right now, a huge portion of the surveillance that occurs in everyday life is private surveillance. It's corporate surveillance. And that private surveillance occurs completely outside of constitutional circumscription. So one of the themes that I develop in my book is what I call surveillance exceptionalism. Because actually before 9/11, there was a far more active discussion in our Congress about the kind of legislation that would curb online practices, and, you know, largely couched in the language of privacy. And I do believe that we have blown by the privacy issue into many other equally complex issues. But there was a lot of active discussion about that, and literally within a 24-hour period after 9/11, all of that discussion stopped, and a new discussion took over. And that new discussion was about, we need certainty, we need total awareness, we need to know. And that new zeitgeist created an environment in which these fledgling companies that were discovering and elaborating surveillance capitalism were protected and were nurtured. And many of the capabilities that the government needed, but might have been outside constitutional parameters, were allowed to develop and flourish inside the private sector. And now, I'm not going to get into it now, but I do have a section that is really fascinating of looking at what the interactions and configurations are between the power that comes from surveillance capitalism and state power, and the different ways in which, in some cases, one is subordinate to the other. In other cases, they switch roles, and the state is subordinate or the private sector is subordinate. But they have to work together, and the government has to work through the private sector to get a lot of what it wants. And of course, the ultimate endgame here, the nightmare fusion here, is something like the Chinese social credit system, where the power that we see developing in surveillance capitalism and state power are fused in these huge data practices. So that's one thing. I want to say something about workforces, and I want to say something about politics. So, you know, I spent the first good big section of my career studying workplaces. The Smart Machine book that Ruth mentioned, a big section in that book was called The Information Panopticon, and I wrote about what has only gotten worse, but the very detailed practices of computer-mediated surveillance of workers, and now it's gotten to a truly bizarre state. But here's what I've learned, the way I make sense of it, and that is that our workplaces actually are the habituation contexts for a larger social program, a larger societal program. Somebody mentioned the idea of captive, but the idea is we have workplaces where we're trying out these very detailed methodologies of surveillance, modification, and control. But it's not just for the sake of those workplaces. We have habituation contexts. I would include casinos. I would include airports that are inventing and experimenting. And then we see the same templates being rolled out on a societal basis. And that's why I said to you at the beginning, includes but extends far beyond the labor capital nexus, right? And so I'm really fascinated by what the forms of resistance are, because people who are workers are also citizens. So like, we're helping construct these systems in our, as employees and as workers, that then we are subjugated by as citizens. So it's like, we need to be thinking of ourselves as individuals, and how, in addition to all the new kinds of organizing efforts that you were talking about this morning, you know, how we stop our workplaces from being the R&D labs for a much broader and even more consequential tyrannical kind of future for all of us. Okay, so number 3, politics. There's talk of Big Brother, and there's talk of fascism and so forth. I'm not going to get into it now, but I will tell you that I spent an awful lot of the last 6 years studying and making an argument as to why what we're seeing develop here is not fascism, and is not totalitarianism, and is not Big Brother. That's why I write about Big Other. Because what I see here, and I didn't get a chance to get into this piece, but I showed you, I'm pointing over there where it used to be, you know, what I call the new means of production. But in this larger context, when we go around that whole cycle of the new means of production and prediction products, behavioral future markets, and so forth, that whole cycle is what I call the means of behavioral modification. And what this is really moving toward is a kind of system not of terror and murder, but a kind of system of much softer behavioral control over populations, but also over individuals. And it's not just about what we buy, and that point is very well taken. You know, it's not just about what we buy. It's about where we go and what we do and how we do it. For example, one of the things I do in the book is to analyze Pokemon Go as a surveillance capitalist experiment, which was actually a data experiment to test the new means of behavioral modification in order to perfect the means of tuning and herding populations through urban geographies. So we're talking about something that is, I'll go back to my word, unprecedented. And when we say fascist and so forth and so on, that's, for me, that's the horseless carriage. That's rubricizing a new thing in terms of the bad stuff that we already know. But this is different, and I really want us to be able to learn about how it's different. Today I can only scrape the surface, but I'm putting a flag in the sand on that point.
Well, resistance. I mean, yeah, the new digital technology has been very useful, and it's kind of in the flourishing of a new media, right? And we're living through a renaissance of a kind of radical media. But that's different technologies of surveillance, I think, which I think are harder for movements to use and harder to hack into. In terms of the state, I mean, I did mention the state as regards the example of this guy Balthasar, who's under a state program of surveillance, but, you know, operating in the private sphere. And that's my point was that this is a very clear service of the state to employers, using all this technology to build. You know, they basically season this guy. They terrify him and they break him down using technology and interviews. And then, you know, once his mentality is thoroughly pulverized, he's released back out there without a bracelet, you know, there must be a kind of a knock-on effect throughout the workforce, and there's a lot of people in that situation. But yeah, clearly the state is one of the main beneficiaries of all of this. The CIA's venture capitalist firm, In-Q-Tel, was an early investor in Facebook and many of these other companies. They presumably buy vast amounts of this information and data mine it, the state, that is. The state is also a host to the parasite of big tech. I think of the example of Vermont and its attempt to create a healthcare system. They hired a firm out of Canada, a Montreal firm called, I think, CGI or GCI, I forget the acronym exactly. And its business model is to get so embedded in the client's operations that divorce is impossible. This cost the state of Vermont $270 million to create a website that didn't work, and the whole thing collapsed. So in terms of like value production, there's this question in my mind, at least, like how much of what big tech is doing is producing value, and how much of it is just kind of rent seeking, like capturing profits, capturing rent, but not, not through actual productive activity, but through a parasitic relationship to the public sector and to the private sector to some extent as well. There's the famous line, I forget which economist who said it was, that maybe it was, I think it was Paul Samuelson's, right? That the computers show up everywhere except in the productivity stats. Robert Gordon, in his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, makes a very persuasive case that a lot of this technology is really like friction, is a drag on profitability. The constant updating of software, that you can show that the original shift that happens in the 90s from paper records to electronic records leads to an increase in productivity, but then it sort of stops. It's not clear that, all of these programs 2.0, 03, whatever, on and on and on, actually deliver increases in productivity. That may be changing. I mean, we're coming out of what was, seeming like this cyclical stagnation, the new normal of low growth. Maybe productivity will increase again, but I don't know. The state is also important in that it is the institution that can limit this stuff, right? I'm thinking of the law that will probably not pass, but has been proposed in New York State to say that employers cannot call employees after they're done working. You can't text them, you can't call them, right? To just say, the state has to step in and say, no, this is called home, this is work, get off the phone. And those contradictions of the state, that the state is one of the main propagators of this, funders of this, users of this surveillance technology, and actually one of the key institutions for limiting it by creating legal firewalls to say like that big tech has to stop at the door of the house. And finally, I'll say that, I am not the kind of person who advocates individual actions. I write about the environment. People are always asking me, like, should I stop eating meat? This kind of stuff. I'm almost always like, politics is by definition when you act collectively, so there's limits to what you can do personally. But around this tech issue, I find myself sounding like an anarchist, which is like, you got to get offline. I mean, a lot of this stuff is volunteered, right? We don't have to participate in this. And so I think that the left should develop a kind of a culture of resistance at the level of individuals, of dropping out of technology. You don't have to be online. You don't have to tweet. You don't have to be on Facebook. It's not the end of the world. In fact, it's better for your mind. Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, shows how constantly being online fragments our consciousness, that the short-term memory and the long-term memory don't connect, and you don't actually build schema and remember stuff if you're constantly making executive decisions about, should I click on this link or not, or that link. So there's an important case to just saying, no, I'm not going to participate in all these possibilities. And maybe I'm being naive, maybe it's wishful thinking, but part of me thinks that like a lot of this stuff, the Internet of Things, it's like, are people really going to spend more for a refrigerator that can tell you that your milk with a radio frequency tag is halfway done? I mean, who wants to deal with that? And then, I mean, this is like a certain kind of elite upper middle class is going to do this, and then the stuff will be broken, and people who buy it secondhand, like, are they going to, use these features? I wonder how totalizing that stuff will be.
So the one thing I'll say, because I'm really interested in the question, is that I disagree on the go off the grid point, just from my own experiences these last few months of organizing retail workers online. Like, we have a campaign right now with Toys R Us workers. In these next few weeks, 30,000 people are losing their jobs, while KKR and Bain Capital, who looted that company, they were $11 billion in profit, and they looted that company. The CEO got millions, and they're not, they said they had a severance policy, and they said, we're not going to give anyone money. So we're flying Diane Rosales from Emeryville, California, where she won a fair work week. She earned $17 an hour, lost her job. Her phone got cut off, though, still, because it's not enough in California, because rents are $4,000 a month. But her and her daughter are flying across the country to tell their story to Congress, to say, you need regulatory action. I need you to tell KKR and Bain Capital to give me and my daughter some severance pay so we can get our lights turned back on, right? And so that's the power of the internet, right? Like, her voice is gonna get heard. And she doesn't know it. She's just trusting some strangers on the internet and getting on a plane to tell her story. And there are 10 other workers from Arizona, Texas, Michigan, that are flying, North Carolina, states that matter to our democracy. They're gonna go say, this is what happens when you deregulate Wall Street. And that is only because of the internet. And so that's, to me, that gives hope in the possibility. Yes, Facebook's watching it all, but like, I don't know, they're at Congress too, testifying, trying to defend themselves, so we'll see.
Okay, we're gonna have another round. Where's the microphone? Oh, you're right here, I'm sorry. Let's start on that end for a change. I don't want to be biased toward my side of the house, so to speak. How about the guy with the striped shirt, and then after him, the woman in the red?
Hi, my name is Bill Callie, and I'm an alumnus of the Murphy Institute, very proudly so. Using my understanding, horseless carriage understanding of capitalism, could you tell me how value, as traditionally defined as necessary labor, is created and extracted in this new surveillance/information economy?
Carol Huang, City College. My question, maybe it's not framing as a question, but in a way that we could organize, because it's pretty much those surveillance are voluntary. So for my example, I could make an example. Ben Grosser at the University of Illinois invented, I think 3 years ago, a machine that will automatically input Webster dictionaries, any kind of term, difficult terms, into Google. So he also have his profile, and that disrupt his Google profile profoundly. So I think one time we search, but on the other side, we could not search, but do the disruptive act on Google. That will probably benefit majority of us, and could start a movement just to disrupt these behavior surplus accumulations from Google. So by do a random search or the search that you don't need, and that will be a counter action to kind of make their profile not workable, not reliable in many ways. So individually, I think people could follow Ben Grosser's way of disrupting the Google search machine. And on the other side, I think it's voluntary. So again, a lot of things that we could think about through individual level, how to do regular and daily behavior instead of just refusing to go online. And I wonder, after you research so much about how it works, there's counteractions other than refusing it, to have something like you can suggest.
There was one in the back here. And maybe we can do both of them while we're back in this far corner really quick.
Hi, my name's Katie. You briefly touched on this, but I just wanted to see if you had any more to say about how the government influences new technology that's created, specifically the military. I know that especially with like hardware technology, driverless cars, drones, technology that is going to have consumer-based uses, the seed money and the ideas for those start from the military, and how that we should contextualize that in this conversation.
Okay, I'm Sam Adler-Bell from the Century Foundation. Hey. I have one very quick comment, which is that I do think we have to be careful when we talk about this exit strategy, which is that it's more available to some people than to others. One of the things that happens on social networks is you develop social capital, and that social capital is differently necessary for different people in different positions in the economy, and the choice to just get rid of all of it is more available to some of us than to others. The question is, one of the things that people seem to be talking about in some of these spaces about how to deal with the surveillance capitalism problem is reconceptualizing our relationship to the data. So we tend to have like a debt mentality in relation to data. We trade our data in exchange for services that we want. But other ways we could think about data is either data as capital or property, and it's something that we have a property interest in. We generate the data. And so you could imagine a situation where workers, for example, who generate data as part of doing their work, like say Uber drivers who produce data about how transport moves throughout a city or throughout the economy, that they could negotiate into contracts that they might have at some point, some kind of value that they generate as a result of that extra work, which isn't being accounted for in their wages at the very least. The other idea is thinking of data as labor, which some people have started to talk about. When I'm on Twitter, I am doing work, and it's producing value for somebody. So that is also labor. And I guess just opening that up to the panel as potential resistance strategies, and whether we can produce that mentality in certain ways.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Bill, your first question is better answered by Shoshana. But I will just say, like, I'm really interested in this movement of, like, we own our data, we own our behavior, like, the information about us, and a movement for privacy and self-determination around your data, and also that we're contributing. I love the idea of like, these platforms as social goods, and then, like, thinking about the wealth that they're garnering as, like, that actually that should be stuff that is, like, Google is a platform. It should be, that wealth should be funding America's schools, making sure we have health care, free child care. Like, why not, right? And so I really think that is like an exciting, like, populist opportunity. That's what I'm sure others will have more to say.
Yeah, in terms of value, I mean, at one level, value is produced through this service, search, right? People have to create this technology. You use that technology, that service, and in exchange, ads are sold to a third party, and so it's much like a free newspaper, right? Like, how's value produced by someone who writes for a free newspaper? It's like they write these articles that people want to read, and they see next to those articles ads, and the ads pay for it, right? So, I mean, in that regard, it's an old-fashioned model. There is also the selling of the dossiers, right? All this generated information that Shoshana was talking about, these predictive products, and I'll be interested when your book comes out to see who's buying this stuff, how much information there's in that, because one assumes that there's a lot of secret sales to the government too, right? That buying these dossiers, so that's income. So the labor that produces these dossiers and these technologies is producing value then. And I think it's a very good point about the unpaid work, that when you're on social media, you are working. It's unpaid work, so if you want to get really strict about Marxist definitions of value, maybe it's not actually value production. It's more like the unpaid labor of reproduction, which doesn't itself produce value, but it produces labor power, which then produces value. But, I mean, it seems like it should be considered a type of unpaid work that produces value. In terms of the military, Mariana Mazzucato in her book, The Entrepreneurial State, uses the iPhone as a perfect example. There's like all the key 12 technologies in the iPhone are all produced by the public purse, mostly through the military, from GPS, which is still subsidized to the tune of $8 billion a year by the U.S. taxpayer, to the smart glass. So yeah, a lot of this stuff is developed with public money in universities, licensed by the military, kind of brought to scale and beta tested by the military, and handed off to the private sector. In terms of this, we own our own data. I would push back against that. Why do we need all this data around? I mean, someone else is going to own it as well. As Foucault says, transparency or visibility is a trap. I think the goal really should be to set limits, to say, like, not everything should be captured as data. And laws have to be placed around certain spaces like the home, and as somebody said, you know, this should be part of labor contracts to like push back on what kind of data can be collected. Not like we should own it too. It's like, one reason I don't like that is because it's this creeping commodification, right? This idea that like the commodity form is okay as long as we control it. No, some things simply shouldn't be commodified, right? Here the market should not go. So how do we push back against that? We need movements, and I think it's state laws have to just draw these lines. Just like they say, here you may not dump your toxic sludge, here you may not put your cameras and your radio frequency badges and collect information on people.
Yeah, these are great comments. Ben Grossman, Grosser. Artist, is he still Brooklyn-based? No. Oh, in this school? Okay. Well, anyway, I love his work. And one of his things, he has something called the demetricator, which was originally for Facebook. So it's an interface that you add to Facebook, and you can participate in Facebook, but you see none of the metrics. So you don't see how many likes, and you don't see how many friends, because those are the reinforcers that are shaping your behavior. So you get to have the goods on Facebook without being a target of behavior modification, and that's really cool. And he also has one now for Twitter, the Twitter demetricator. So I love his work, and I write about his work, and other artists who are a brilliant avant-garde of artists all over the world, who are focusing their genius on how to hide. How do we hide in our own lives? So I write about them, but I say that this is, to me, poignant and heartbreaking, that we've come to a place where some of the best and brightest among us are helping us figure out how to hide in our own lives. This is not okay. On the other end of the spectrum, this generation, the best and the brightest of this same generation have devoted themselves to increasing click-through rates as part of the data priesthood of these companies, which have now literally cornered the market. They're taking people out of academia, they're taking people out of science, and they're employing people lavishly to run the new means of production. So these are huge asymmetries of knowledge and power. So I'd like to try to link that back to this morning's conversation a little bit about collective action, because there was such a fertile conversation this morning about collective action. and you know, new ways and getting workers involved and new groups of workers and so forth. You see, users, I believe, are an even larger subset than workers. And users, which is pretty much all of us, are now literally sources of raw material. There's a cliche, you know, like if it's free, you're the product and so forth. I don't agree with that at all. Users are sources of raw material. This is a pure extraction operation. In fact, I say that one of the overriding economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism is extraction, the extraction imperative. So users are raw material. The raw material is being taken from users through their interactions with products and services. I'm going to your question now. So you remember that closed loop I showed you, the behavioral value? So they're still doing that, but just enough. And the aim of just enough now is to be sticky, to get you engaged, to bring you in. So like Zuckerberg says, well, you know, we're going to close down these profiles for access to these other things now, and we're not going to do so much news now because that's getting us into trouble. So what are we going to do? We're going to do friends and relationships and intimate things and videos and family and all of this. These are the richest sources of behavioral surplus. So he's saying, okay, you don't want us to do those other things? We'll do these things that are even better for us, right? So that loop at the bottom there is continuing to function just enough to bring your stuff in, to bring your raw material in, which is your experience, your human experience. That is the object of dispossession. That is what is unilaterally turned into data, much of which becomes surplus. So where the value is being created is in the secondary markets, the behavioral futures markets. That's where revenue is being produced, that's where profit comes from entirely. The rest is what you need to do to get there. Now, the idea that I want to before I talk about data as property, I want to introduce one little concept, which is the idea of the declaration. John Searle, linguistic philosopher, I'm very fond of his work. You know, he writes about the declaration. The declaration is an unusual kind of statement that in one statement it says how you want something to be and also says that it is already so. Classic. Let there be light. A declaration that by saying it makes it light. Okay? So how did we get to a place where human experience, I'm going to try to connect these dots, I see you. Human experience becomes raw material for these other markets, others' objectives. That was a declarative kind of act, where right in the beginning, Google declared human experience is ours for the dispossessing. It's free for us to take it, to transform it into data, to use it as surplus, and so forth. So in relation to these kinds of declarations, we have a couple of choices. Now this is Zuboff's language. I call them counter-declarations, and I call them synthetic declarations. So as far as counter-declarations go, that's what these beautiful artists are doing. You know, Ben and Adam and all these beautiful people, you know, they're helping us hide. And those are counter-declarations. You know, encryption is a counter-declaration. Protect us. We need that. We need counter-declarations. But we really need synthetic declarations. And in synthetic declarations, we say, this is not okay. This is not legitimate. And here I completely agree with Chris. the idea that our experience is now available for scraping and rendering into profit streams for others' ends, this is not okay. It was done unimpeded by law. It was done with intentional secrecy. It was done with means that are inscrutable to all but a very narrow class of priests. This is illegitimate. So if we say, oh, let's share the ownership of the data, we are instantiating, we are further institutionalizing that original declaration that said it was okay to make it data in the first place. This should not stand. Once we're talking about data, we have been successfully distracted from the first two key steps. One, the dispossession of experience, and two, the rendering of that experience as data. And they have engineered the entire conversation to distract us, to misdirect us from those ultimate fundamental acts. Hannah Arendt called them the original sin of simple robbery, at that level of primitive accumulation. So let's not talk about data. Let's talk about legitimacy. So the last thing I want to say, I'll sit down, is collective action. These are all collective action problems. And synthetic declarations are going nowhere without collective action. And I'm thinking, while we're figuring out new ways to target new groups of workers for new forms of collective action, let's not stop there, please. We need to be organizing users with 21st century forms of organizing into 21st century forms of collective action. Because if we're going to say no, we can't do it as individuals. We have to say no as a city. We have to say no as a community. These are collective challenges. So I believe now that, again, going back to my initial language, includes but goes far beyond the labor capital axis, that we are looking at, for this century, new ways of imagining collective action. Final thing. I also said early on, this is not a story about technology, this is a story about capitalism. To me, that is good news. Why? Because we actually, our society, other societies, we have experience curbing capitalism, taming capitalism. We saw it in the progressive decade. We saw it in the New Deal. We saw it in mid-century legislation. We have experience in taking raw capitalism and tethering it to society. And it's imperfect. But, you know, in 1912, people were still getting murdered for trying to organize. And by 1950, that was very different. It's imperfect. But we have experience taming raw capitalism. We can do that again. We just can't do it in the way we did it the last time. We have to do it in a new way that's suited to this problem, to this new behemoth. Do not dismiss this as, I'm sorry, this is one place where I disagree with you. Are you talking about IoT, Internet of Things? Pretty soon you will not be able to buy a refrigerator that's not Internet enabled. You won't be able to buy a television set that isn't listening to you, and you probably won't be able to tell whether it is or not, unless possibly if you live in Germany, and that depends possibly on the way in which the new GDPR is actually enacted by its own communities. So these things are very, remember that number I gave you, practically 4,000% in 3 years before we ever even knew about this. Capital is on the line here. This is now how people are going to chase those high margins where the rest of the marketplace in products and services is utterly commodified, this is where the high margins are. This is why everyone is going into competition for behavioral surplus. So please, let's not underestimate this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to, ask for just 2 more questions and then some quick responses, and then we will have a break, and we have yet another conversation to encounter. So let's start with you. What was that? And Hannah? What
You've had your hand up for a while back there, I think.
Okay, so let's make those the 2 questions.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm Merle Ratner from the International Commission for Labor Rights and the Laundry Workers Center. So first of all, I want to say that people are still being killed for organizing here and around the world. And I think one of the lessons of this, just to be respectfully disagree, is that I don't think we can, and we can have reforms, but the capital relation is going to continue, and this is going to get worse unless we develop another system. So to me, that's part of the lessons of what you've all been saying. But what I wanted to say is that 2 things. One is that it seems like all this sounds very new, but at the end of all these information that they get, they're still trying to sell you something, So that part just seems like a more sophisticated version of what's been going on. What's new is, to me, the new kinds of labor discipline, which maybe not that new, the way that this is being used for wars, which has pretty serious implications, and the way that it's developing the new forms of precarious labor and the gig economy, which has implications that we really haven't discussed yet. In terms of strategy, I don't think we can get rid of the information technology. On the other hand, I think we do have to be very careful what Christian was saying. So we can, Twitter, Facebook is very good for organizing a demo. It's not very good for doing long-term movement building, long-term education, and for developing strategy that can be implemented at scale. And we've got to be really careful about that because we're getting more and more isolated. The other thing is that there's a growing level of alienation and loneliness that this is being encouraged by this surveillance technology and whatever. And that's really mitigating against agency and collective action. If we don't look at that and fight for how we want to use technology, it's going to be harder and harder to organize, except in the most instrumental ways.
Okay, and finally, about the Ministry of Loneliness in Britain, right?
Thanks. Hi, my name is Vadim Albinsky. I was wondering, is there a way to safeguard against some of the risks of surveillance while keeping some of the good stuff? So, there are areas where we already, submit to small amount of surveillance where we could really do a lot more to save lives. For example, the government tracks disease, so, you go to a hospital, the government knows about it, and they can predict an epidemic. So we save lives. Let's say we did that better. The government tracked more disease, your entire health record, saved millions of lives. Let's say education, we already submit to surveillance. Teachers know how their students are learning. There are smart classrooms now. People really want to do that a lot better. And what if kids who are behind grade level in reading could all of a sudden not be behind grade level? Or let's say self-driving cars, what if surveillance allows them to be safer, it tracks where everybody goes, and we save, again, millions of lives? So is it possible that if we start really controlling these things, the only way to do it is just piecemeal get rid of all of it, we're going to do way more harm than good. Like the things we're preventing aren't as risky as the things we could be, saving.
Okay, do you want to start, Carrie? So just to riff off of that, of the question of okay, so I think many of us would say data and this data-driven thing with schools is just actually causing a lot of problems, right? It's not making education better. It's it's actually making things worse. So I think the school and data thing is actually, and the fact that we know that kids are failing reading isn't actually making them resource more books in the schools, right? Like data doesn't then lead to investment in the right solutions. Instead, they're let's fire some teachers and cut their pay, right? So I think that you have to have a political analysis in what the data what data is being tracked and what it's going to come, you need to know what you're looking for. And I think like if you're and so I think the school debate on data is like its whole other realm that actually I think we can learn a lot from as we think about what do we do about data in every other parts of our lives. And I think we can learn a lot of how data is not necessarily going to get us to utopia, and actually it's just going to be used to further an agenda that doesn't get us anywhere. The other end of it, though, just in response to what was said before, I've been thinking a lot about data in the workplace and how actually it can be a thing that is a measure of accountability for workers. And so in the case of the retail workforce that's marked by insane occupational segregation along race and gender, like 73% of all cashiers are women, and they're getting totally automated out, right? I mean, I can just like run off a bunch of occupational segregation stats, but it's like criminal. You could just basically sue based off of the data on occupational segregation in grocery retail, for example. So if you had that data and you were able to say, we have it on the industry level, but if you actually had it on the company level, where you could actually prove that there is systemic discrimination happening across a company-wide level, well, then you can actually create policies that say, look, we know based off of this demographic analysis of the workforce, this is actually the level of distribution that you should have in terms of diversity and representation, and we're going to create incentives for you to get there or accountability if you don't get there, right? Like, it actually can become a tool to create the world that we want in terms of employer behavior. So I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, we can expose how the instability in hours is causing chronic black underemployment in the service economy. We have that data. Companies say they don't. We debate about them in every city and state where we're running fair work week policies. They actually have that data. They're just not looking for it because they don't want it. And so I think that's a question. I think there is like really interesting debates around how we actually use data for power and like, yeah. So, but it's super complex. And I think the question of, there's a difference between data in the workplace and the data in the rest of our lives. And I think we're starting to like tease out some of that.
That's a good point. When I wrote The Soft Cage in 2003, something I didn't deal with in the book, but in question and answers, people brought this up a couple times about how, you know, it's not just that the state has surveillance, people have alibis, right? And it kind of, this kind of alternate use of data was kind of hit me when in one of these events, African-American guy was like, it's like, hey man, I fit the description. And when I'm getting like a weird vibe that the cops are out like, you know, freaking out and could grab me, I go to an ATM machine and take out $20, you know, and I have a receipt of where I am in time and space. So there, yeah, I mean, there are these counter uses for some of this stuff. Good point. I mean, the tech in the classroom, self-driving cars, I'm very skeptical about this stuff. I mean, you know, they should basically just take all technology out of classrooms. You could do, I mean, there's been no improvement, right? The amount of spending on technology has gone through the roof. The number of administrators that are then required has doubled. And what, are college students smarter? No. You know, it doesn't produce anything. We want smaller class sizes and books and just sit around and talk about books. That'd be great. And that relates to alienation, right? Which is like, I think alienation, I've been thinking about that in terms of these like mass shootings and stuff. It's like people aren't talking about the obvious thing of like, how are these young white guys getting so alienated? And it's like, I think alienation became a sort of verboten concept in the 90s because it implies a sort of an essential nature or self from which one is being alienated or something old-fashioned and essentialist like a species being or this and that. And so we no longer talk about it. We never update it into some sort of, you know, more nuanced notion, but absolutely right that technology creates alienation. And I agree wholeheartedly with your points about deep organizing versus sort of mobilizing.
I believe that there are huge possibilities for the improvement of human life and society in the digital, and that these life-giving digital capabilities have been hijacked by a rogue capitalism. That this particular rogue capitalism that I describe isn't about selling us things, that it does that, but that's not the main thing it's about. It's about selling us to others, selling bets on our behavior to others. It's selling predictions about our future to others. And if we stay with that idea that it's just, you know, selling us stuff, so yeah, it's like old-time advertising on steroids, we're losing the big picture there, which is exactly what they want us to lose, because it's all happening in a way you can't see it. So my bottom line here is that what surveillance capitalism is an outrageous hijack of digital capabilities that should be used for us. You ask, can we do good stuff with this, health and so forth? Well, I start out with the aware home. Before surveillance capitalism, that was the idea. We were going to produce data, and it was, you know, and it was going to be for us, and we would have control over it. And capitalism intervened in a way to change that relationship and to hijack it, so that now you can't even get data from your home without it going to thousands of other places. So unless we get a hold of the capitalism, we can't get what we should get from the technology. That's why I keep coming back to those formulations. Thank you.
Okay, we could have gone on much longer, but we are out of time, I'm sad to say. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And I believe there's coffee and maybe some snacks or something outside, and we come back in 15 minutes for the final session, which is on disaster, capitalism, and the ecological crisis. So please don't go away.